In 1999, two high school kids left a graduation party and never came home. No accident was ever reported. No trace was ever found. Just a quiet night on Ridge Road that swallowed them whole. But 20 years later, a backhoe chipped into the side of that same ridge and hit rusted metal and bone. And I knew before anyone called they'd found my brother. Before we start, tap subscribe to help bring these stories to light. Some names should never stay buried. My name's Jillian Barrett. I'm from a town called Fairfield, about 45 minutes east of Charlotte, North Carolina. These days I work in hospital administration. Nothing dramatic. I'm 32 now, live in an apartment that doesn't get enough sunlight, and I keep a mug of tea on the counter. I forget to drink most mornings. Back then, though, life felt small and simple. We lived on a quiet cul-de-sac where everybody knew everybody. My dad was a mechanic who never rushed a job. My mom stayed busy between church committees and baking enough lemon bars to feed a neighborhood. And Eli, he was my older brother, was the one who tied it all together. He was 18 when he disappeared. I was 6. I remember how he used to roll his motorcycle into the driveway with this half grin like he was trying not to seem too proud of it. It had this flame decal, loud, bright, totally not his style, but he'd built that thing from junkyard parts and hand-me-down manuals. That bike was the only flashy thing about him. Everything else was just steady. He was the kind of person who always showed up. Walked me to the end of the street when the bus was late. Covered for me when I spilled juice on the living room rug. That last week before graduation, he was different. Not in a way I understood at the time, but looking back, he seemed restless, focused, like he had something planned. There was a girl named Sadie Quinn. He'd been seeing her quiet and steady since junior year. She'd come by in the afternoon sitting cross-legged on our porch while Eli worked on the bike. She didn't talk much to me, but when she did, her voice was soft, kind. The two of them looked like they had a secret they were holding between them. The night of the party, Eli said he'd be home late. "Don't wait up," he told me, ruffling my hair on the way out. I was sitting on the steps holding a grape popsicle that was melting faster than I could eat it. I watched him ride off with Sadie behind him, her backpack slung over one shoulder. It was just supposed to be a short trip. A night, maybe the weekend. That's what they told Mom. But Monday came. Then Tuesday, and then someone from school asked me if my brother had really run away with that Quinn girl. At first, my parents brushed it off. "They'll turn up," my dad said. "Probably got caught in some back road trouble." But then my mom stopped answering the phone. My dad stopped going to work. Flyers went up. Police took statements. And still, nothing. And that was it. By the end of the summer, people stopped talking about it. Some folks said Sadie was pregnant. Others said Eli had always been looking for a way out. The sheriff told my parents it was probably just two teenagers who wanted to start over somewhere else. But even at 6 years old, I knew that wasn't right. Eli wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Not to me. I moved away after high school. Tried not to think about Fairfield too much. The house got rented out after Dad passed. Mom went to Florida. The town just became a place I used to be from. Until that morning, 20 years later, when I saw the news. The segment was short. A construction crew blasting through rock on the Route 7 expansion had uncovered what looked like a damaged motorcycle and human remains. They showed grainy drone footage of a ravine, a white tent, and a rusted bike being lifted onto a tarp. I don't know how long I stood there with the remote still in my hand. But the second I saw that gas tank, the faded flame decal, I said it out loud. That's his bike. And just like that, Fairfield wasn't behind me anymore. The detective called the next morning. His voice was calm, measured, like he'd rehearsed how to say it. He told me they'd recovered items at the site. Some bone fragments, a leather jacket, a rusted chain necklace, and a wallet too water damaged to make out much, but one piece had held together enough to read a name. Eli Barrett. He didn't ask if I could confirm anything over the phone. He just said, "We'd appreciate it if you came in." I left Charlotte within the hour. The drive back to Fairfield took 4.5 hours, but it felt longer. I hadn't been back in over a decade, not since my mother moved to Florida and the house got rented out. Most of the people I'd known had either aged out or moved on. When I pulled into the coroner's lot the next morning, the fog still clung to the trees just like it used to. A woman in a windbreaker met me at the door and walked me down a quiet hallway. The room was small, just a table with a tray laid out. There was no body, just the things that had surfaced with the motorcycle. The jacket was faded and torn down the sleeve like it had been caught on something. The chain was tangled in the lining, and the ring, charred but unmistakable, had once belonged to our dad. He gave it to Eli the day he graduated. I didn't need a DNA test to tell me what I already knew, but I nodded anyway and let the examiner speak. She said they'd confirmed one set of remains, but no trace of a second body had been found. Nothing to suggest another person had gone over the edge with him. I asked if they were sure. She said they were still searching. That night, the story made the local news. A 30-second segment buried between a high school bake sale and a cold front rolling in from the west. They showed the ravine now fenced off and taped up, and that same crushed bike being lifted onto a canvas tarp. It looked small, unrecognizable, but I knew what it was. And I knew without question that Sadie had been with him when he went over. I remembered her standing in our driveway that night, bag in hand, waving to me like she'd see me in the morning. I couldn't explain why I was so sure I just was. Fairfield's police department hadn't changed much. Same stucco siding, same patchy parking lot. Inside, a whiteboard had already been covered with old photos, pushpins, maps of the ridge and ravine. Sheriff Hunsley stood beside it with 2 deputies and one new-faced Detective Caleb Voss. He was younger than I expected, clean-cut, quiet-eyed. Didn't say much at first, just took the file and sat with it. Hunsley told me they were reopening the case officially as a homicide. Said they wanted someone on it who wasn't tangled up in the town's past, someone with distance. I told them whatever they needed they could have. I didn't have answers, but I still had memory. I spent that afternoon at the old house. The renter had moved out 6 months earlier and the place was empty. Still smelled like cedar and old newspapers. The attic was just as I'd left it. Box after box with faded labels. I found one marked Eli. School stuff, and sat down cross-legged beside it. There was his denim jacket, a bent photo strip from a movie theater, and near the bottom a wrinkled receipt from a motorcycle parts shop dated a week before he disappeared. I held it for a long time before I remembered the last thing he ever said to me. "Don't wait up." I didn't understand then what he meant, but I think I do now. Back in town, the rumors moved faster than the news ever could. Fairfield had a way of filling in blanks before anyone could confirm the facts. At the diner, 2 waitresses whispered while topping off coffee mugs. One said Sadie had stopped coming to church around that time. The other said her mother wore sunglasses inside for a month. A man at the bar said he'd always known something was wrong, that Eli wasn't the kind of boy to run. I listened without speaking. Caleb was doing the same. He told me later that local chatter could be half noise, half truth. Sometimes the stories filled in gaps the files never touched. But sometimes they were just a way to rewrite what people didn't want to remember. He started pulling old records, original incident reports, witness statements from the graduation party. Some were gone entirely. Others had been blacked out or filed with no follow-up. Many were submitted by then-Sheriff Roland Dorsey, the same man who led the original search, who insisted there was no sign of foul play, and who just so happened to lease the Ridge property that summer. That piece changed everything. When Caleb told me about the lease agreement, I didn't say much, just stared at the line on the page where Dorsey's name had been printed. He'd come into our house back then, stood in our kitchen, and told my parents to give it time, that Eli probably just needed space. Now we knew he'd had a key to the Ridge the entire time. Caleb took the report and drew a map marking the tree line, the trail, the drop point. We hiked the ridge that afternoon. The woods were thicker than I remembered. 10 minutes in, we found a clearing. An old shack sat half-collapsed into the slope. Inside there were rusted tools, papers too water-damaged to read, and one fragment with an official town seal faded beyond recognition. Nothing definitive. But something about it didn't feel random. That night, Caleb reviewed drone footage and sent me a still shot. The trees, the outcrop, and in the corner a ridge turnout. He said the tire tracks at the site didn't match anything logged in the original reports. No search vehicle, no patrol car, something else. Early the next morning, I flipped through an old folder in my motel room. School notes, flyers, yearbook pages. A hand-drawn invite to the 1999 graduation party was tucked inside. The paper was beer-stained, the photo stapled to the back, mostly faded, but in the background, barely visible through the smoke near the fire pit, stood a man in uniform. He wasn't smiling, just standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching. I took a picture of it and sent it to Caleb with one line. He lied. He texted back 5 minutes later. On my way to talk to him now. I didn't reply. I just stared at the photo, the way Dorsey had stood there. Like he knew something no one else did. Like he'd already made up his mind. We weren't even 48 hours in, and everything I thought I knew about that night was already cracking open. And I had a feeling that whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be easy to look at. Caleb didn't waste time. He drove straight to the edge of town, where the Dorsey house sat behind a leaning wood fence and a patch of dying trees. The front yard was bare, no car in the driveway, no porch light, just the slow creak of the screen door when he knocked. It was Sheriff Roland Dorsey who answered. Older now, hair gone white, stomach heavy under a flannel shirt. But his eyes were the same. Still watchful, still distant. Caleb introduced himself, said he was reviewing the Barrett Quinn file. Dorsey didn't blink, said I told everything there was to tell back then. When Caleb showed him the photo from the party, the one with Dorsey standing in the background, there was a pause, then a shrug. I might have stopped by, he said. Saw a bunch of kids drinking. Didn't stay long. Caleb asked why he'd never mentioned that in his original statement. Wasn't relevant, Dorsey said flatly. And the search zone you led, why was the ravine never examined? There was no reason to look there, Dorsey snapped. No tire marks, no sign of foul play. But Caleb knew better. The documents we'd found showed Dorsey had leased the ridge that Summer had access, had motive, and now had a story that didn't line up. When Caleb pressed further, Dorsey's tone shifted. You're stirring up ghosts, he said. This town's made peace with that story. Maybe you should too. Caleb didn't answer. He turned and left, but he told me later he never once felt like he was leaving that man's eyes behind. I spent that same afternoon combing through the original case records, what was left of them. More than a dozen witness statements were missing. A handful of others were redacted so heavily the text was nearly unreadable. There was one from the night of the party filed under an officer's badge number, but with the name blacked out. The officer of record, Roland Dorsey. Half the paperwork had been logged improperly. Some were never signed. Others had been marked incomplete and filed anyway. It was like someone had wanted a paper trail, but one full of holes. I sat in the corner of the records room and stared at the folder in my lap. For years, everyone had believed Eli and Sadie ran away. But nothing in these reports pointed to a chase or a plan or a clean break. It was just a blank space, and someone had made sure it stayed that way. A day later, I drove to the county hospital on a hunch. I'd heard that Kristen Allman still worked there, a former classmate of Sadie's, someone I remembered seeing in old yearbooks, with her arm draped casually over Sadie's shoulder in a few photos. I waited near the back entrance where nurses came out on break. When she finally appeared, I stepped forward and said her name. She blinked at me, then softened. "You're Eli's sister," she said. We sat on a bench out in the courtyard, flanked by a patch of half-dead shrubs and the sound of HVAC units humming overhead. I told her we were reopening the case, that we needed anything she remembered. Kristen stared down at her coffee for a long moment before speaking. "Sadie changed that spring," she said. "She got jumpy, quiet, like she was always watching the door. I asked her once what was wrong. She just said she was tired. But it wasn't that. I asked what she thought it was. She hesitated, then said, 'Fear.' That's what I saw in her. She told me Sadie had started skipping school events, avoided certain people in the hallway. Kristen didn't know specifics, but she thought someone had been following her, pressuring her. She mentioned a boy Sadie had dated the year before, said the breakup had gotten messy. But when I asked for his name, Kristen clammed up, said, 'You'd know if you saw him.' That was all she gave me. I told Caleb about it later. He nodded, then showed me something he'd been working on. A map of the ravine site marked with where the bike was found, and a wider radius for potential remains. A forestry crew had been clearing brush earlier that week and found bone fragments along the outer edge of the clearing. Small. Weathered. Caleb flagged the area and brought in a forensic team. I stood with him while they worked slow, precise movements, gloved hands brushing away dirt. But when the technician approached an hour later, her face was calm. "Not human," she said. "Canine. Probably a stray or a coyote." I stepped back, unsure if I felt relieved or disappointed. The not knowing still pressed in from all sides. A few days later, about 60 miles north, a woman stood in a gas station in the town of Red Hill. She'd stopped halfway through reaching for a soda when the local news segment played on the mounted TV above the counter. They were showing Eli's photo again, the motorcycle, the crash site, the renewed investigation. The cashier asked if she was all right. She said, "That was someone I used to know." Left the soda behind and walked out. I didn't know that part until later. What I did know came the next day when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was low, clear, and careful. She asked, "Is this Jillian Barrett?" I said yes. "My name is Sarah Keller," she said. "I think I may have information about the case you're working on. I saw your brother's picture on the news." I didn't speak right away. She continued, not over the phone. "But I think it's time I told you what happened." Then she hung up. I stared at my screen, heart still hands cold. A reverse lookup gave me the location Colonia, a dot on the map in the northern foothills, small enough to barely register. I walked back inside the station where Caleb was sorting field notes and said, "We need to go for a drive." He didn't ask questions, just grabbed his jacket and keys. As we pulled onto the highway heading north, I kept thinking about that voice. The way she'd said Eli's name. Like it still meant something. Like it hurt to say out loud. Neither of us spoke much on the drive. We didn't need to. Whatever we were heading toward, it had already begun. The drive to Colonia was silent, the kind of quiet that sits heavy on your chest. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road ahead, the sun flickering between the trees as we left Fairfield behind. Every so often, I'd glance out the window and catch a glimpse of my own reflection, older than I remembered, tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I thought about Eli, about the last morning I saw him sitting at our kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug, about Sadie's careful voice when she spoke to me about all the moments that slipped by while everyone else moved on. When we finally pulled up to the address Sarah Keller had given, the yard was crowded with overgrown shrubs and a white fence leaning into the weeds. An older woman met us at the front door, soft-spoken and watchful, her dog barking in the hallway behind her. "She's out back," she said, and nodded toward the side of the house. I followed Caleb along a path of cracked flagstones and stepped into the garden. The woman sitting at the table didn't turn until we were nearly upon her. When she did, I recognized her eyes first. Sadie had changed. Her hair was streaked with gray, her cheeks thinner, her posture uncertain, but there was no mistaking her. She stood up, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then she spoke my name. "Jillian?" She said, her voice barely above a whisper. For years I'd imagined this moment, tried to picture what I'd say if I ever found her, or if she ever came home. All I could do was nod and step closer. Caleb introduced himself and asked if we could sit. Sadie didn't argue. She sat across from us, hands folded tight, her gaze slipping from mine to the empty yard and back again. I asked her if she was ready. She took a slow breath and started. She said people had always gotten it wrong about Eli, about her, about that night. She wasn't running away. Neither of them were. She said Eli had planned everything down to the hour they'd leave after the party ride out on his motorcycle and start new somewhere else. He wanted to see the ridge at night, said the sky would be clear and the road was beautiful after midnight. Her voice grew quiet as she told us about Xander Dorsey. She said she'd dated him before Eli. It ended badly, but he didn't let go. He left notes on her porch, followed her after school. Once he left a dead bird on her doorstep. Her mother told her not to stir trouble. His father, after all, was the sheriff. I asked her if Eli knew. She nodded, said he'd started to worry, but she tried to downplay it. She didn't want anyone else to get caught up in Xander's anger. That night after the party, she said Eli was in a hurry to leave. She climbed on the bike behind him and they pulled out onto Ridge Road. The moon was bright. She remembered the sound of the wind and the rush of hope she felt finally moving forward. It was maybe a mile outside of town when they noticed headlights behind them. At first, Eli thought it was another car or maybe a hunter leaving late, but the truck didn't pass. It stayed close, too close. Sadie said she recognized the shape of the sheriff's decal and her stomach dropped. She thought it was Roland until the truck pulled up beside them and she saw Xander behind the wheel. There was no mistaking him. He didn't try to pass. He just swerved closer, crowding them toward the edge. Eli yelled, tried to get them away, but the road narrowed and there was nowhere to go. Xander rammed the motorcycle. Sadie said everything went silent after that. She remembered the crash, the weightlessness, the blur of trees, then nothing. When she woke up, she was on the ground. Her leg was broken. Eli was beside her, not moving. She said she touched his shoulder and knew right away that he was gone. She didn't cry. She just waited. Drifted in and out of consciousness for what could have been a day, maybe more. She was found by a man named Leo, who lived in a trailer off the logging road. He was older, a little odd, but kind. He carried her back to his trailer and nursed her injuries. She begged him to take her to a hospital, but he said he didn't trust outsiders. He said people up there were dangerous and she should stay hidden. She stayed with him for months, then longer. When she finally heard news about the case, that the search had turned up nothing, that people thought she and Eli had run away, she figured nobody would believe the truth. By the time she left Leo's trailer, the world had moved on. She changed her name, found a job up north, tried to build a life from scratch. She never stopped thinking about Eli. She said the only reason she'd reached out now was because she saw his photo on the news. She knew it was time. As she finished, the garden felt unbearably quiet. I couldn't find any words for a long time. Caleb leaned forward, thanked her for telling us. He asked if she'd be willing to give a formal statement. Sadie hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "If they know I'm alive, they'll come after me," she said. Caleb promised we'd keep her safe. The three of us sat together for another hour, asking questions in low voices. Sadie answered all of them. She gave details about the party, about Xander's threats, about the sheriff's truck. Every piece added to a story that never should have been hidden. When we finally left, the sky had turned pale. I turned back to see Sadie standing alone at the edge of her garden, one hand pressed against her chest as if bracing herself for what would come next. I knew that feeling when the world moves on and you're still standing in the middle of it, holding the same unanswered questions. Back in the car, Caleb looked straight ahead. "This isn't just a case anymore," he said quietly. I agreed. For the first time in 20 years, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. We drove back toward Fairfield as the sun set the air thick with the weight of everything we'd learned. When we reached the edge of town, Caleb's phone buzzed with a new tip, someone claiming to have seen Roland Dorsey's truck parked near the ridge the night Eli disappeared. The message was unsigned. We exchanged a look, both understanding what it meant. Nothing in Fairfield stayed buried forever. It was nearly midnight by the time we got back to Fairfield. The air was thick with that late summer heat that settles in and never fully lifts even after dark. I lay on the couch in my rented cottage, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of insects outside the window. The day had left me wrung out, every muscle in my body heavy from holding on to too much for too long. I didn't sleep much, and by sunrise I was already back at the police station, flipping through old files in the hope that something might shake loose. Caleb was there before me, already hunched over his desk with a mug of coffee, his jacket slung over the back of his chair. He barely looked up when I came in, just nodded as if we were both keeping watch over something neither of us could name. We worked in silence for an hour, paging through decades-old statements, news clippings, police reports that all seemed to contradict each other in small but frustrating ways. Some files had been redacted, others were missing altogether. The more we tried to piece the story together, the more obvious it became that someone had gone out of their way to keep the most important parts hidden. Mid-morning, Caleb stepped away to take a call, and I stayed at the desk, running my finger down a list of names from Eli's graduation party. That's when I noticed a single line in one witness report from that night, scrawled in a different handwriting than the rest. Saw the sheriff's truck near Ridge Road around midnight, lights off. There was no follow-up, no detail, just that one sentence tucked into the middle of a page. I brought it to Caleb as soon as he got back. He looked at it for a long time, jaw set. "That's something they missed," he said quietly, but I could tell he was already thinking 3 moves ahead. That afternoon we visited Wyatt Strong, an old-timer who'd volunteered on the Firewatch patrols back in the late 90s. His house was a rambling one-story set back from the road, the porch cluttered with battered boots and fishing gear. Wyatt had a stubborn way of talking, slow, careful, always weighing his words. Caleb asked about that night, about the truck, about anything he might have seen from his post. Wyatt didn't answer at first, just sat with his arms crossed and stared off toward the woods. Finally, he said, "I remember seeing headlights up by the ridge. Odd night. A lot of yelling on the scanner, then nothing." Caleb pressed him. "You sure it was Dorsey's truck?" Wyatt nodded. "I'd bet my life. He didn't offer more and we didn't push. Sometimes you can feel when a man's already said all he's willing to." We left quietly. Back at the station, Caleb started digging through the old county vehicle logs, hoping to find something, anything that would prove what we already suspected. The records from June 1999 were either missing or incomplete, and what little was left had gaps days with no entry at all. Caleb stayed late that night, flipping through microfilm and faded property ledgers, piecing together any fragment of fact he could. Around midnight, he hit on something, a lease document for the land above the ravine, signed by Roland Dorsey himself, dated just months before Eli and Sadie disappeared. The parcel stretched right up to the tree line overlooking the spot where the bike had been found. When Caleb showed me the paper, I read the sheriff's name and felt something cold and hollow settle in my chest. For years, that man had told my family to give it time, that Eli would turn up with a sheepish grin. All the while, he'd had a stake in the one place nobody ever looked. I remember standing on the sidewalk outside the municipal building holding that printout, the streetlights washing everything in pale orange. "He led the search," I said. "He told everyone there was no reason to look up here." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe he knew exactly what we'd find." We started cross-referencing every old news story, every line in the police file. It was slow work names, half-remembered details blurred by time, but there were patterns. Statements that had been pulled and never resubmitted. Witnesses who stopped talking after their first interview. And the map, Eli's sketch map, the one I'd found in the attic, was suddenly missing from my bag. I'd kept it locked up in the cottage, but now the desk drawer was ajar and the map was gone. Nothing else was touched, just that one folded sheet. The door was locked, the windows still latched. Whoever had come in knew what they were looking for. I called Caleb right away. He was there 10 minutes later, flashlight in hand, checking every frame and latch. "No sign of forced entry," he said, keeping his voice even. "Either someone picked the lock or they have a key." I sat at the kitchen table staring at my hands. It was a quiet kind of fear, not panic, just the slow realization that someone in this town was watching what we did, waiting to see if we got too close. The next morning, the precinct was quieter than usual. Caleb spread out everything we had on a table in the back, the map, the lease document, the old patrol logs, the witness report about the truck. Every piece pointed to a story that was just out of reach. The facts didn't line up, not the way they should if it were just a runaway or an accident. Someone had worked hard to erase the truth, but the edges of the lie were starting to fray. As I sat there flipping through the same crime scene photos I'd already seen a dozen times, I noticed a small detail I hadn't caught before. In one picture near the edge of the frame, there was the faintest impression of tire tracks, set deep, wide-angled toward the ravine. They didn't match any known search vehicles or the coroner's van. I circled them and handed the photo to Caleb. He studied it for a long time. "Those aren't from a county car," he said, "but they could match the make and model Dorsey drove that year." He looked up at me. For the first time since all this started, I saw something shift in his eyes. "We're getting close," he said. I nodded. In that moment, the story wasn't about rumors or old gossip anymore. It was about what had always been there, waiting to be seen, hiding in plain sight, ready to change everything the second we put the pieces together. We spent the next several days moving in and out of the station, our routines dissolving as new pieces came together. It was late one evening when Caleb pulled me aside with a look that said he'd finally found something that mattered. He'd gone through a stack of archived reports, not just the ones on Eli and Sadie, but anything connected to Dorsey the Quinns, or the old party crowd from 1999. He pointed out a brief overlooked incident report, a confrontation behind the high school gym just weeks before the disappearance. Xander Dorsey had cornered Eli, threatened him in front of witnesses. The statement ended abruptly, stapled to a note that read, "Filed, no action required." Caleb didn't comment, just slid the paper across to me and let it sit there while I read it. I thought about Sadie's voice in the garden, how careful she'd been describing Xander's anger. It was never just about her. It was about power, about control, about what happens when people like Xander are protected by someone in uniform. Caleb looked up and asked if I was ready to go back out to the ridge. The sun was already sinking, the sky washed out and pale, but I said yes. We drove in silence, the air thick with dust as we took the winding road past the tree line. We parked at the same turnout where the crime scene tape had hung weeks earlier. The forest was quiet, almost indifferent, the ground covered with the same brittle leaves and pine needles as the night Eli and Sadie left. Caleb led the way to the edge, retracing the tire marks we'd spotted in the old photographs, checking them against new impressions in the dirt. He crouched near a patch of brush and motioned me closer. There, barely visible in the failing light, was a narrow path cut through the undergrowth, faint but unmistakable, like someone had forced their way through in a hurry. I stood still, listening, the woods pressing in close. We followed the trail as it hooked around a fallen log and up a rise, then stopped abruptly at the back of an old hunting cabin, nearly lost beneath vines and moss. The roof sagged. The windows were crusted with grime, but the lock on the door was new polished brass on warped wood. Caleb pulled on latex gloves and jimmied the lock open with a slim tool from his kit. The door gave with a sigh. Inside, the air was musty thick with the scent of old paper and rodent droppings. A shaft of evening sun cut through a hole in the wall, illuminating a scatter of debris bottles, empty cigarette packs, a frayed sleeping bag tossed in the corner. There were boot prints in the dust, some fresh enough to leave a mark. At the far end of the room, a half-rotted desk stood beneath a cracked window. I searched the drawers while Caleb scanned the walls, flashlight beam moving slowly. In the bottom drawer under a pile of receipts, I found a tattered notebook. The cover was torn, the first few pages missing, but the rest were filled with hurried handwriting. Some entries dated after the disappearance, some full of names and places that didn't make sense. On one page, the words Ridge Midnight Truck stood alone, circled in thick blue ink. The next page held a list of initials EBSQXD. Caleb took photos of everything, then carefully bagged the notebook. He checked the cabin for other signs: broken glass, old food wrappers, an empty bottle of prescription painkillers dated 1999 with the Dorsey family pharmacy on the label. The rest of the place was bare, but the atmosphere lingered dense with the echo of decisions made in the dark. When we stepped back outside, the air had cooled. It felt like the world had changed while we were inside. On the drive back, neither of us spoke for a long time. My mind drifted to Sadie, what she'd endured after the crash, what it must have meant to be hidden, to hear her own story, twisted and erased, while the rest of us just learned to live with not knowing. As the lights of Fairfield came into view, Caleb said quietly, "Someone used that cabin recently. Someone who didn't want us finding it." I nodded. The image of the notebook burned into my mind. Back at the station, we worked late cross-referencing the names and dates from the notebook with the police records. Several matched up to witnesses who'd changed their stories or gone silent soon after the case went cold. It was enough for Caleb to draft a warrant for the Dorsey house and to request backup from state investigators just in case. I went home that night and sat in the dark, the evidence spread out on my kitchen table. The notebook, the lease, the witness reports, the missing map, the tire tracks. All of it pointing in one direction, and all of it circling back to the same family who told the rest of us to move on. I didn't sleep much, and by dawn I was back in the car with Caleb watching as officers gathered outside the Dorsey residence. The house was quiet, windows drawn, no sign of anyone inside. Caleb knocked, called out, waited. When no one answered, he opened the door with the warrant in hand. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and something sour beneath it. Drawers had been left open, clothes scattered, a duffel bag overturned on the floor as if someone had packed in a hurry. The television was on, but muted, a travel program playing to an empty room. Upstairs, closets hung, open, contents ransacked. In the main bedroom, the safe was open and empty. Caleb walked through the rooms in silence, stopping every so often to take a picture or jot a note. "They're gone," he said at last, voice flat. As we left the house, a radio alert crackled in from dispatch, a bolo for a black Lincoln Navigator, registered to Roland Dorsey, last seen heading west with 3 occupants. The state police were on it, and within the hour, news came in that the car had been spotted at the county line. The chase was short, roadblocks, dash cams, and finally a lineup of cruisers boxed in the SUV near a way station. I watched the news footage later that night, flashing lights officers moving in the unmistakable shape of Roland Dorsey pressed to the pavement, hands behind his back. His son Xander cuffed and staring at the ground, face smeared with dirt. Their wives standing off to the side, children huddled in the back seat, stunned. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded in my lap as it all washed over me. The people who had closed the case, who had shaped the narrative, who had stood in my parents' living room and said, "Give it time," were finally exposed for who they really were. But even then, as the mugshots flashed across the screen and the news anchors recited the facts, I couldn't let myself feel anything like relief. There was still more to come, and the hardest truths had yet to be spoken. The days after the arrest blurred together in a way I've never experienced before. I remember the courthouse was a mess of reporters and satellite vans, a line of townsfolk pressed up against the railings, everyone watching to see what would come out in the open after all this time. The news traveled fast, faster than truth sometimes, and yet the truth finally had a chance to speak. I spent most of that week at the precinct, drifting between evidence rooms and conference tables, the old files spread out in front of me like a puzzle that could finally be solved. Sadie gave her formal statement first, sitting across from Caleb in a private room with only a legal pad and a glass of water between them. She told the story the same way she'd told us in the garden, steady, careful, unwilling to leave out a single hard detail. She spoke about Xander's threats, the feeling of headlights closing in on them that night, the moment Eli tried to speed up hoping to escape, and the terror when the truck forced them off the ridge. She described the crash in halting words, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she did not look away when she said Eli's name. Afterward, I gave my own statement, what I remembered from that last night, what Eli had said, what my parents believed for all those years. It was quieter than I expected, like we were finally letting the silence breathe. Caleb spent hours sifting through the notebook from the cabin, the pages with names and dates and the initials that matched up to nearly every witness who'd gone silent after that summer. There was enough to draw a timeline to show how the story was shaped by those who decided what should be remembered and what should be left out. When Xander was brought in, he kept his eyes down, fidgeting with the cuffs at his wrists. He started to deny everything, but then Sadie stepped into the room and just stood in the doorway silent. He saw her, and in that moment his face drained of color. He stammered, tried to talk around what he'd done, but the words wouldn't hold together. It took only a few minutes for the truth to spill out. "I just wanted to scare him," he said. "He took you from me." He claimed he never meant to kill Eli, but the words sounded empty, brittle compared to the evidence we had. Caleb had the whole confession on tape, and when he replayed it in front of Roland Dorsey, the old sheriff didn't speak for a long time. He just sat there, elbows on the table, staring at his hands. Finally, he exhaled and looked up. "He called me that night," Roland said quietly. "Panicked. I found the wreck. He was crying, didn't know what to do. I did what a father does. I fixed it." He spoke plainly about burning evidence, redirecting the search away from the ridge, telling everyone, my parents, the town, even his own deputies, that the kids had probably run off. He never said he regretted it, only that he'd buried a scandal, not a boy. Caleb let the tape run until it ended, then quietly gathered the evidence and stood. I followed him out of the room, the fluorescent hallway humming overhead, both of us feeling the weight of what had finally come to light. That night I sat in my car outside the courthouse and watched the town empty out the news trucks, idling in the parking lot, everyone waiting for the first official statement. I kept thinking about all the years we spent not knowing about the difference between silence and peace, about how quickly a truth can unravel when someone finally refuses to let go of the thread. The courtroom filled up the next morning. The trial was fast by most standards, so much of the story already confessed on tape, so much evidence laid out for the jury to see. Sadie took the stand, her voice clear as she spoke about Eli's last moments, the choice Xander made, and the night she survived in the woods alone. She didn't ask for pity, just told the truth. Expert witnesses followed analysts' forensics, even a retired archivist who described how the original search maps had been altered to keep the investigation away from the ridge. I watched from the gallery, hands folded in my lap, as the verdicts came down. Xander was found guilty of second-degree murder. Roland was convicted of obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and being an accessory after the fact. They barely looked at each other as the sentences were read out. There was no shouting, no outburst, just the quiet shuffling of lawyers gathering their notes, the steady murmur of people in the hall. I left the courthouse into the glare of the afternoon sun and breathed in the air heavy with dust and the lingering scent of cut grass. There was no sense of victory, no sense of triumph, just a strange kind of quiet. The truth was finally out, but nothing could bring Eli back. That evening, I stopped by the cemetery where the maintenance crew was still setting the new headstone. Sadie met me there, a single flower in her hand. We stood together at the edge of the plot, watching the last light of day catch the carved letters of my brother's name. I listened to the sounds of the town cars on the highway, birds rustling in the oaks, and thought about the years it took to reach this moment. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing in the right place, no matter how much it hurt. As we walked back to the car, Sadie touched my arm and said, "He tried to save me. That's what I'll remember." The words settled between us quiet and unshakable, and I knew that some stories don't end with justice. They end with the truth finally spoken aloud. After the trial, Fairfield felt like a different place, but the change wasn't the kind you could see on a map. Some folks in town were relieved, ready to close the book, while others looked at me and Sadie with that mix of pity and suspicion that never fully fades. There were handshakes outside the courthouse, a few quiet apologies from people who'd never believed us, but mostly there was just the slow unwinding of daily life. Kids heading off to school, the old men meeting at the diner, the river running steady past the edge of town. Roland Dorsey was sentenced to 25 years for obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact. The judge's words were measured and final, but there was no triumph in the verdict, only a muted acceptance that justice, when it finally arrives, does so in its own slow way. Xander Dorsey got 30 for second-degree murder. He didn't look up as the bailiff let him out, just kept his eyes fixed on the floor, hands trembling against the cuffs. I found myself thinking not just about Eli, but about all the ways a family can be twisted by secrets. How the lines between loyalty and guilt can blur until nobody can see their way out. The story made the state news a headline for a day or two and then faded into the background. But for us, nothing faded. Sadie moved in with her aunt for a while, quietly, almost invisible in the day-to-day rhythms of town. I went back to the house on Elm Street, boxed up the rest of Eli's things. Old yearbooks, faded baseball caps, a stack of letters he'd never mailed. I kept coming back to the cemetery not out of duty, but because I didn't know where else to carry the grief. The morning of Eli's burial was cold and bright. A thin mist still clung to the trees as we gathered under the oak at the far end of the lot. Sadie stood by the grave, a single white lily in her hand, her shoulders drawn in tight. I watched her place the flower on the casket, watched her lips move in silent prayer, or maybe just memory. The words that needed saying had already been said in the courtroom. What was left was private. I stayed back, letting the rest of the mourners drift away before I approached. The ground was soft under my shoes, the grass wet and shining in the morning sun. I knelt by Eli's headstone and set down the old glass ring, our father's past to Eli lost, then found again. For a while, all I could hear was the wind moving through the trees. Later that day, Caleb stopped by the house, standing on the front porch with the awkwardness of a man who's seen too much. He told me the state police commissioner had commended him for his work, but he said it with a shrug, as if it barely mattered. He said he wasn't sure what came next, but that I'd done something most people never have the chance or the courage to do, keep digging, even when the world wanted you to stop. I thanked him. Neither of us lingered in the doorway. I don't remember much about the week that followed, except how ordinary it all seemed. There were errands to run, groceries to buy, laundry to fold. Sadie called sometimes, her voice thin but steady, always ending with, "Thank you." I never knew how to answer. At night, I'd walk through the old house and let my hands rest on the banister, remembering Eli as a boy chasing me down the stairs, laughing free. In those moments, the years collapsed, and all the sorrow felt new again. The truth had come out, but closure didn't. Maybe it never really does. The town's scars were quieter now, but they were still there under the surface in every sidelong glance or sudden hush. The folks who once whispered about runaway kids now spoke about justice as if it had always been inevitable. But I remembered how hard it had been to get here, how many doors closed, how many people turned away, how easy it would have been to give up. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'd drive out past the ridge, the trees looming close on either side of the road, the shadows thick where Eli's bike had gone over. I'd park on the shoulder and step out, listening to the wind moving through the pines, feeling the cool air on my face. I'd stand at the edge, remembering all that was lost and all that was finally brought into the light. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, and it wasn't peace. It was something quieter, a kind of steadying the weight of truth settling into the bones of this place, unmovable and lasting. The last thing I did before the season changed was return to that ridge one more time alone. Wildflowers had sprung up where the earth was broken yellow and purple and pale blue, pushing their way through rock and gravel. I brought a small silver locket that Sadie had given me inside a picture of Eli and me from years ago, both of us grinning arms, linked, sunburned from a summer that feels like another lifetime. I tucked the locket under a stone at the base of a flowering rock just inches from the drop. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the cold, and promised myself I'd remember all of it, the joy, the loss, the fight to keep going long after everyone else moved on. I still walk past Eli's room some mornings, pausing with my hand on the doorframe, letting the hush settle in around me. There's a softness to the air now, a sense of release I never expected to find. The house is quieter, the town too. Some faces still look away when I see them in line at the grocery store. Others stop me just to say they're sorry it took so long, or that they wish they'd spoken up sooner. I don't carry anger anymore, just the weight of memory which feels lighter than it once did. Sadie lives in another state now. We talk sometimes about small things, her job, the changing weather, the way certain songs still catch her off guard. She's found a life for herself, but I know the past follows her in its own quiet way. She told me once that every spring when wildflowers start to bloom, she remembers Eli's voice clear as day calling her name. Some pain, she said, never leaves you, but it changes. It gets softer at the edges. The Dorseys are gone from Fairfield. The trial is already a story that new neighbors only half remember something that happened back then. But every year when June comes around, there's a hush in town, a reminder that truth, even when it's unwelcome, finds its way through. Caleb transferred upstate not long after everything wrapped up. He left me a note, just a line or two, thanking me for refusing to let things stay buried. He said he'd learned that justice is slow and sometimes unfinished, but always worth chasing. As for me, I find comfort in routines again. I tend to the garden. I sort the mail I keep, Eli's old class ring in my pocket some days, rolling it between my fingers like a small promise to keep going. I don't visit the ridge as often, but when I do, I stand at the edge, breathing in the wind, feeling the years close around me. I know now that love isn't measured by how long you get to keep someone. It's in the fight to remember them honestly, and in the courage to tell their story, even when it would be easier to let it fade. If you've listened this far, thank you for letting me share this with you. Every name deserves to be remembered. If this story meant something to you, maybe let someone else hear it too. Sometimes keeping the truth alive is the best kind of justice any of us can give.